All right, hopefully you can hear me. Hi, I'm Yuri Cantrell. I'm with the Academic Partnerships and Visiting Program section, which is just a few floors up in this building. I'm here to introduce Dr. Luis F. Seoane, head of the BIT Lab at the Institute for Evolutionary Biology of the Spanish National Research Council. His background is in physics and computational neuroscience with a PhD in complex systems. He has works in neuroscience, maths of Darwinian evolution, complex networks, linguistics, and he often studies how complexity affects systems and vice versa. So his talk is titled Asymmetry and Complexity in Neural Systems.
Thank you very much for the introduction. Can you hear me properly? Thank you. And thank you for being here, and thank you for having me here. I will be visiting until the end of next 5-6 months, more or less. And today marks precisely 1 month since I arrived to OIST. I'm super happy to be here. This is a splendid place. My first time on this part of the earth. So thanks again for allowing me to speak today. I will be talking about complexity of the brain, symmetry, and where it comes from, how it goes away. Before that, I work in complex systems in a broad sense. The complexity is an interesting concept that is all the time under definition and redefinition. If you go to experts of the field, they are discussing what is complexity, how should we model it, and so on and so forth. And people from outside the field are a skeptic, like what is this even worth to use the word complexity, or what are you talking about? I view complexity a little bit like life. It is difficult to define. It exists. The fact that it exists affects systems all around us. The fact that some systems are more complex than others, even if of the same kind, makes them behave in different ways. Some people are pushed a lot, and they say all the field is hubris. You will not stop studying biology only because you don't know if a virus is alive or not. In the same sense, we should not stop studying complexity even because we don't agree on definitions. We can say something is there, and we go and we research, we observe in the world what it is, and we try our mathematical models as hypotheses of what it might be. So I work in complexity in a broad sense. I like to study how complexity affects systems, and the other way around, how systems make complexity flourish around us. Examples are in sorry, it doesn't work. Is there someone who can help me? Okay, I might need to click on the slides. Never mind. So as I said, I study, this doesn't work. I just need to click on it. It's okay. As I say, I study complexity in a broad sense. A favorite example is social systems. In this work here, we made something funny inspired by spectrography. We designed a kind of a spectrogram that allows us to uncover when social groups jump in their complexity as a matter of size. And we discover things such as, well, below, now it works. Okay, I know why it doesn't work. I was pressing the wrong button. We can find suspicious scales below which social systems are simpler and above which they seem to organize themselves suddenly into hierarchies of greater complexity, all based on observations that we do on the dynamics happening on those social groups. Another example that I worked out a few years ago, sorry, it's new, had to do with economy, specifically what happens to an economy when you allow people to cheat on it. People are saying all the time, oh, the game is rigged, the markets are rigged, the economy is rigged. Okay, let's take this at face value. Let's admit if it is rigged, how does it change Nash equilibria that you might find, and how does it affect the complexity, the economic complexity that can be built around us? A huge question regarding complexity in the natural world has to do with biology. Why do we observe everything that you have outside, all these different trees, species, all the complexity that you have in the mammal world, in our cognitive world, and so on and so forth? There seems to be some agreement in biology that complexity is not selected for Darwinian evolution, that all the complexity that we observe is a random fluctuation. I can talk about this more some other day, but part of my work in my PhD thesis with my PhD supervisor was to make explicit mathematical models in which complexity is actually selected for, to prove that there is a mathematical reason for the complex life that we observe to appear. And a huge driver that we find driving complexity forward are parasites, in which the complexity of a host and the complexity of a parasite push each other forward in arms races, similar things. And now more recently, this is like a broad scale model of how complexity might evolve over time. But more recently, I've been looking at how it builds from the bottom up. This is a study of genotype networks of viruses evolving in real time. And this is a group of people behind this work. Susana Manrubia is the great intellectual behind this effort. All in all, it's a great journey. I wanted to present this because I'm here, I'm new, and I want to present the kind of topics that I work in. If you're interested in any of this, I will be super happy to expand this on a seminar further on. But today, complexity, symmetry, and the brain. This question came from discussion, once again, with my PhD supervisor. Some of the work that I will present was with him, but most of it I did on my own. He is I don't know if you know Ricard Soler, he's one of the main people in complex systems in the world, and he's brilliant and very human and very deep thinker. And he makes these beautiful drawings that remind us of Leonardo. In a series, he was exploring alternative walls. Why don't we observe a super symmetric brain? When you look at our brain, there are some things that it's a little bit twisted, it's a little bit bigger on the front than in the back, or the opposite side, the opposite for some people. Why don't we observe something in which symmetry is completely absent? So he was wondering these questions about alternative walls. Before he did that, long time ago, people were discussing about symmetry in the brain, and they were even discussing about any structure at all in the brain. 200 years ago, there were a strong debate between people who propose the brain is a soup. Some people literally thought that it was completely unstructured and that the whole brain is participating of everything all the time. And some other people, phrenologists, were thinking that no, there are actually divisions in the brain, and from those divisions we can learn something. And it's interesting to see how each of them was wrong in different ways, and how each of them was right in different ways. At the time, the debate of whether there is localization of function and whether there is some kind of symmetry or asymmetry in the brain, both debates, they were resolved at once when Broca observed this brain by Louis-Victor Le Bon. He was a patient who had brain syphilis, which caused this. So get tested often because it's a serious illness, it can kill you. And what Broca observed is that when this area was removed, this patient was not able to produce language. He was able to understand language, not to produce it. So at once he realized there is some localization. This area here does something. Losing it means that you lose some function. There's localization in the brain. Also, the brain is asymmetric because he was able to observe the same kind of lesions at the other side of the brain. And he will not observe a loss of language in general. He observed this in several subjects, not only one. And he proposed a conjecture, which is, of course, we humans are so intelligent. We are so cognitively advanced that we have asymmetric brains. But animals in general, they should have supersymmetric brains because they are simple. He proposed that. He just sent it out there. And this conjecture stood assumed and untested for many, many years. About 120 years later, people began to gather evidence of asymmetry in the brain. First, the important one came from birds. It turns out that the eye that is facing towards the outside part in the egg determines which eye is going to be used to look for prey and which eye is going to be used to look for food in birds. More evidence about asymmetry in different animals accumulated. Chimpanzees seem to use the left hand to manipulate things close by and the right hand to reach out. All of these here are fish. And these fish, they make something simple. They swim straight into a wall and then they turn. For some of these species, all of the fish turn in the same direction. So there has to be some asymmetry there. There is an asymmetry in behavior, something has to cause it. For some others of this species, some of them turn to the left, others to the right, but always consistently. Each individual usually more often to one direction than the other. So there is evidence, there is more evidence of brain asymmetry in the animal world. So people modified a little bit the conjecture by Paul Broca, and they suggested, well, it is not that we humans are asymmetric and the rest of animals are perfectly symmetric. It is that the more cognitively complex that you are, the more intelligent that you are, the more asymmetric you should be. And this, once again, was took for granted more or less in the field. From time to time, you find this written in a book with not a lot of references. It was difficult for me to piece out how the story came together. The conjecture is there. You hear it also in neuroscience schools, computational neuroscience schools, but this hasn't been properly tested. I didn't touch anything. Okay, thank you. So this hasn't been properly tested. On the one hand, from the empirical world, it is difficult to measure complexity, and it is difficult to measure asymmetry also. Until very recently, it was only measured in a few parts, like Wernicke's area and a couple other modes. I'm also working on measuring that. On the other hand, mathematically, there hasn't been a framework to pose these questions properly. So I took up the task. I say, wait, can I make a minimal mathematical models that captures everything that I think is essential for this question and try to tackle Broca's conjecture? I got inspiration. Well, I put all the results in a paper that I will explain in the following. What I did is grounded on utilitarian calculations, which have been used before, for example, by Edward O. Wilson to find mathematical laws behind the number of casts that you find in an ant nest, different casts. Or it was also used by John von Neumann to discuss, and this is direct inspiration of my work, to discuss how can you have a working computation when the parts in your circuit are faulty. Von Neumann has this very nice paper that I recommend to everybody, in which he discovered that, well, there is an issue. If your parts are crashing all the time, you will not be able to make a good computer. How much redundancy do you need? And I think that there is a key there, redundancy. So for a minimal model that we base on an utilitarian framework that can tell us something about complexity and symmetry of the brain, we need to capture something that has to be with how faulty your parts are, something that has to be with how much cost each one of the parts in your circuits carry, and how much benefit you extract from it. Let's suppose a simple case. We don't have complexity yet. We have a very simple task, and we have two circuit candidates. One, spoilers. So you have a circuit at the left side, a circuit at the right side to solve a potential task, all right? So each one that you activate each of these circuits, you're gonna have to pay a cost. And the amount of cost that you pay for this is gonna be proportional to the time that you activate the left side or the right side to solve this simple task. If you activate the two of them at the same time, somehow you have to coordinate them. And this can be very easy. This can be just a majority vote. It can be more complicated. It can be I gather evidence from the left and the right, and I integrate them. What I care is that I'm going to put a cost to individual activation of the different circuits and another cost to another circuit that coordinates the two sides, all right? And I posit that if I fulfill my task correctly, then I gain some reward. So what you see here is the likelihood that the left circuit is on, the right is off, and the left circuit doesn't make a mistake. Plus the likelihood that the left is off, the right is on, and the right circuit does not make a mistake. The likelihood that the two of them are on, and at least one of them performs correctly. This is a simple case that I will study. In the paper, you have generalizations of this, like what happens when these things are nonlinear, what happens when they cooperate, and the probability that they work good together is better than working independently, and so on and so forth. So what matters is I have a cost for activating each of the circuits, a cost for coordination, and something that I win, depending on some error that the units might make. So the first thing that in this map here, we have how often you use the left side of the brain, how often you use the right side of the brain for this simple unit. We have an utility function, which is put together what you gain and everything, all the costs that you have. So we can search for what is the optimal activation. Is it going to be half of the time each one of them? Is it going to be always one and the other is off, and so on and so forth? But it turns out that of all the permutations of the model that I did, this is the utility function with everything together. Of all the permutations of the model that I did, always, always, always activation is all or nothing, which means that the solutions are either here, which means this task is so costly that it doesn't pay off to make it. Here, which means I activate the two sides at the same time to solve the task, or here and here, which means I activate either one or the other, but not the two of them at the same time. This is good. I don't have to worry about the rest of it. I can just evaluate this, this, and that, and I can make a beautiful map like this that tells me, depending on other parameters, such as the error rates and the coordination costs, when is it good for me to have the two sides of the brain activated, as in here, or to activate only one side of the brain? Okay, but as I said before, this calculation is for a very simple task that we assume is not made up of subtasks. It's the simplest you can get. But if we want to put complexity into the picture, then we need to model tasks that are more complex, tasks that are made up of parts. How do we do that? Well, same idea. We're going to have a left and right sides. And now for a task, I will have a set of circuits that will solve the many steps involved in your cognition. Let's think about this, about something complex in the brain, like language. For this to work, you need to be able to produce language, to understand semantics, to perceive language, to coordinate with the vocal cords, so on and so forth. If any of these fails, it shows up, and you have a huge reduction of the gain that you have. So what I impose now is that my task is made up of several subtasks, like this, and that I gain some benefit if and only if all of the subtasks are correctly solved. We have this parameter here now, m, that appears as an exponent, and this is precisely what it's telling us. It is telling us that you have to solve correctly one subtask and the other, and the other, and the other. And only if all of them are done correctly, the complex task emerges. And when you put this into the equation, something remains the same, which is still only all or nothing activations. And I tried every change possible to make this different, because I thought that sometimes in the brain you have some graded activation of different circuits. But it turns out that within this model, there isn't any graded activation. It's always all or nothing. But something changes, particularly the map, in which you prefer a bilateral or a lateralized solution to your problem. And how much this map changes depends on the complexity of the task. Before analyzing that, sorry, let me a quick checkup with literature. This is a huge effort by a very large group to measure symmetry and asymmetry in a lot of brains, and they have some findings that my model was able to agree with. One of them is the model says, well, if you have a bilateral brain, something that is mirror symmetric, and somehow your error rate, the rate at which your circuits in the brain fail, then you should observe a breaking of the symmetry more often. So this is what these people find is that people with different kind of diseases, some kind of pathologies of the brain, they tend to have more asymmetric brains. Another thing that the model predicts is, well, if my coordination costs go up here or here, also you will tend to go from something bilateral to something more lateralized. What these people here find is that people with larger brains, in which I speculate signals need to travel more from one side to the other to get coordinated and so forth, they seem to have more asymmetric brain. And something that the model also says is, well, if you go to zero error, always you should have a lateralized brain. Just one circuit will do the trick. it's difficult to find a case like this. People in the literature find that people with perfect tune, those musicians that they don't need a reference to tune their guitars, they can just by hearing, they can tell what notes you're hearing. So people with perfect tune, they seem to have the auditory cortex that is devoted to perfect tuning more asymmetric than the rest of the population. So these are nice observations that seem to agree with what comes out of the model. But now let's go to the important question, which is what happens as we increase complexity. In this picture here, I have overlaid the map of what you have when you're solving a simple task and what happens when you have an emerging complex cognitive task. Think of it this way. Imagine that you have a lot of precursors for language, and they have been working separately. And suddenly there is the chance that they all coalesce together to make something more complex, only if they work in coordination. What this map here shows, this curve here is the original map when you have simple tasks. And what is overlaid on it is what happens as you increase the complexity to one cognitive task that is made up of 2 subtasks, 3, 10, 100. And in what I show in this blue area is regions that originally prefer a bilateral mirror symmetric configuration in which you use 2 sides of the brain. As complexity increases, they fall into a region in which you prefer to lateralize. So just one side of the brain. So going back to Broca's conjecture, this says, well, whenever you start from a bilateral configuration, as complexity increases, there seems to be an optimality pressure towards lateralization. Does it mean that we are going to observe it in the brain? No. It means that in a minimal mathematical model, those pressures exist. Nature is not always going to the optimal. We can have suboptimal configurations, and we can have more pressures than the ones that we see here. For example, in our brain, there is a pressure to move to mirror symmetric sides. So there are more pressures that enter the game. But in a minimal setup, it seems that Broca was right. His conjecture can be proved. Nice symmetry breaking as we increase cognitive complexity. But we also have this super interesting region in parameter space in here, in which what we have is a set of parameters for which initial configuration will prefer to have a lateralized circuitry, just one side of the brain. And for all of this, as complexity increases, there is a pressure to recover this maybe a lost complexity, or a lost bilaterality, or to develop it anew. So what this is telling us is that complexity can work in both directions. If your starting point is as bilaterally symmetric, then increasing complexity is a pressure towards breaking this symmetry. And in certain regions of this parameter space, it works the other way around. It calls maybe not for recovering asymmetry, it calls for redundancy, for making a copy-paste of a circuit if you can do it. I don't know if it was motivated by these things, but there are evidence that there were some copy-pastes in, for example, the motor cortex. Evolutionarily, it comes from a literal copy-paste of a somatosensory cortex that we had before being placental animals. So these kind of things do happen in the brain. Small summary of the key ideas of the talk this far. We are doing good with time. I think one important thing is this that I put here. Before I did this work, as far as I know, there wasn't a mathematical framework to tackle these questions. We are expanding this mathematical framework because what it allows is to look for optimality of circuits, their modularity and their configurations when you put complexity into the mix. When John von Neumann was doing his calculations about how many redundant parts you need to make a reliable computer, he didn't take into account that the operations that the computer needs to perform are complex themselves. So you can have redundancy at different levels. That is something that I'm working on at the moment. Happy to talk about that any other time. There is a game between the symmetry that we inherit because we are bilaterians and the symmetry that is needed for a task. Our brains are mirror symmetric because we are bilaterians. The left side is similar to the right side of the brain. And there is a strong argument that can be made that a lot of the history of the evolutionary history of the brain has to do with controlling the brain, with controlling movements. And this is the happy place in which we have a task that is controlling the brain, which is mirror symmetric, and we have a brain that is bilateral. So what you have matches what you need. But there are other cases, such as what happens with language. This is the language network as best we know it. It has been put together in the last 10 years by Yves Fedorenko at MIT and many others. So what happens with language? You don't really need a mirror symmetric circuitry to make language happen, because language doesn't have an inherent mirror symmetric circuitry. So what happens when this symmetry is present in the brain, but not needed by the task? Well, parrots keep apparently this mirror symmetry to produce their language. We do not. Singing birds do not. What happens with movements? The symmetry of the outside wall is different from mirror symmetric. It turns out these are place cells. They are our GPS in a broad sense. They are the ones that we use to move around. Maybe a lot of people know about this. Mice seem to have mirror symmetric place cells in both cortices. The name doesn't come to me right now. We seem to have them only in the left side, as far as I know. This is the GPS used by a fly. It looks more like a donut, and there are good reasons for that. So eventually, what I want to highlight with this is that there is an interplay between the redundancy that we are given because we are mirror symmetric and the symmetries of the tasks at hand. What happens here? What happens when your task, controlling the brain, remains mirror symmetric, but for some reason you lose your mirror symmetry? For example, this is an extreme case when you practice a hemispherectomy, when you remove half a brain. Hemispherectomy is an intervention that is surprisingly effective, but only used in extreme cases of epilepsy. Children who are young enough, 3, 4, 5 years, that have very, very strong cases of epilepsy that don't respond to treatment. Extreme cases, they see a seizure every 3 minutes. The videos they are very striking. It's like seeing a puppet and you cut the cords and the child falls. And these people are not gonna, they do this every 3 minutes, they are not gonna be able to have a normal development. They are not gonna be able to eat on their own, to go to school, do research, whatever. So this is the last resort in resource intervention. It consists in removing half a brain, and it works fine enough. Not only you end up with the epilepsy, also these people are able to have perfectly normal lives. Sometimes some limping remains on the side affected. This person here has some left side removed, so probably the right side is gonna have a limping, but otherwise they can still manage around, they can have children, have a perfect cognitive life, so on and so forth. So this begs the question, how can the brain reorganize itself after such a strong affection? We wanted to study this. We went to the literature and we saw that there were some studies of reorganization after lesions in the brain. Most of these, they focus on relatively small lesions in a model of the cortex. This is what you're seeing here. And the reorganization affects the surrounding areas of the lesion, usually what we found in the literature when we were starting to do these kind of things. If we are talking about removing half a brain, there is something that has to be longer range than just local, as in here. And we wanted to explore these kind of things. So we made a minimal model based on self-organized maps. Self-organized maps, I think they are super powerful tools in machine learning, but I think they have not been so exploited as they should. I think that there's so much more promising than has been obtained. I will not go into the details, but just to show an example here, by providing, this is in the Stone Age of AI, the 90s or even the 80s, by providing examples to a self-organized map of words and their context, the self-organized map spontaneously groups together those words that have something similar. Here you have beer, water, meat, bread. We move on to dog, horse, cat, whatever. These are all names. These are all adjectives or adverbs. These are all verbs. They group up spontaneously. They self-organize, all right? They learn unsupervised. You show them examples and they learn to capture the underlying structure of this example. I will not go into the mathematical details. We use this to make a minimal model of in this case, a somatosensory map, to check what happens when then you make a hemispherectomy on this minimal model. What you see here is the map that we have of our body in the brain. There are two things that we can appreciate. One of them is that the different parts that we sense are organized. The tongue goes before the lips, nose, eye, thumb, the different fingers, it runs through here all the way down to the feet, and then the other way around in a kind of linear fashion. It is mirror symmetric. Let's put mirror symmetry aside for a moment. First of all, we made a minimal model of something that is sorted like this in colors. It goes from darker to lighter, all right? So we wanted a self-organized map to learn something that is linearly organized like that. We did this by presenting bit strings to the self-organized map that they take values either 1 or 0. The likelihood that they present a 1 value depends on a position. Think of this like touching myself along the arm. I touch myself in a position, and this is going to excite a region that is centered in when I put, and you have a parameter that has to do with the width of the thing that I'm touching me with, for example. And again, please, sorry. Okay, there we go. So all right. So I just want my self-organized map to learn something that is located along a line. All right. We make a model. This thing here shows that the model learned to self-organize linear inputs. We practice a hemispherectomy, and we see how this self-organizing map reorganizes itself after the hemispherectomy. And in this example here, it changes from one example to another. But in this example here, what happens, you remove half a brain. So all of these inputs, they become orphan because this upper side has been removed. They need to reorganize themselves. And what happened is that you recreate what you have, but in a smaller stretch. So in this case, in this example, what we are seeing is that after you remove half a brain, all these inputs are orphan, and the self-organized map squeezes the whole representation into one smaller area. And we can think, is this how the brain works? Before that, let's put the next ingredient, the fact that representation is mirror symmetric. So what you have in this extreme is similar to what you have at this other extreme. What you have here is similar to what you have at this other extreme. Here is similar to this one. And also there is still this graded. So you have two elements. One of them is a position, and the other one, the fact that when I touch me here, this reminds me of something that also happens here, because I can see there is a strong visual feedback with somatosensory areas. So you can literally see this symmetry. We modify the model to account for this mirror symmetry, and we observe in this curve we are evaluating this squeezing that I told you about before, and what the closer this curve is to 0, the better this representation works after reorganization of the brain. And what you have is that when you have this model with a linear kind of input and some mirror symmetry, even just a tiny bit of mirror symmetry is enough to make this reorganization path forbidden. That is not how the model reorganizes itself. This is how the model seems to reorganize itself. It seems to work like a book that closes upon itself. And this happens the moment that you have just a tiny bit of mirror symmetry. The tiniest of it is enough to make this other pathway of reorganization happen. And this curve here is telling us that this actually happens super, super strongly. I will not be able to do what this parameter means, but strongly and for a broad range of parameters, this is the preferred form of reorganization of the brain not of the brain, of this model. What happens in the real world? Once again, very difficult to measure. This work is from 2019, I think. I'm not sure about that. And these people have been working with the same group of people who had hemispherectomy in their brain, and then they studied things that have been studied in complete brains, such as the default mode network, empathy network, visual system network, and so on and so forth. And what they find is that usually they see the same half networks that you will see in a complete brain, each one of them reinforced as if they had taken over the tasks of the other halves in this folding fashion. And for those people who didn't have that, more precisely, for those people who had additional connections outside of the usual networks, they found a worse cognitive performance. So this it is. I am not claiming that this is always how the brain reorganizes itself. I think that this is a boundary condition, a starting point, and there are many more pressures that enter the game. But we observe this very strongly, and this very scarce data that we have, I would love to work more on this and test it, but the very scarce data that we have tell us that seems to actually be happening, and when that is not happening, then something doesn't work properly in a cognitive sense. And I think I have 5 more minutes, something like that. So just to finish off, removing half a brain is pretty extreme. Luckily, few people need that. Unfortunately, there are other kinds of lesions that happen more often, such as strokes, that they don't entail the removal of half a brain, but the removal, the loss of a tiny piece of the brain, and with it, the loss of some functionality. And if you go to the literature of brain reorganization after a stroke, there is some discussion and not a lot of clarity of how this reorganization after a stroke happens. On the one hand, there seems to be an effort of the peripheral areas to adopt the function that has been lost, to say, hey, come here, we have room. On the other hand, there seems to be some push for lost function to be moved to the other side of the brain. There is evidence for the one and the other. They don't come together very nicely. So we apply the same model. We say, okay, now instead of removing half a brain, we're going to cause this kind of damage to our maps. When we remove this large chunk, now whatever was represented here is lost. And this is an example that not always this happens, but this is an example in which the functionality that has been lost is reallocated to the other side of the brain. When that happens, this interferes with the previous representation that we had there. And there is some debate as to whether this is good or bad. You don't want your right side perturbed because something bad happened to the left side, so on and so forth. More importantly, there is a question of when that happens. When do you have this reallocation to the other side of the brain? What our mathematical model suggests is that there is a second order phase transition that depends. Sorry, this is important. This is valid, what I say now, for focal strokes, which are, they happen in a contiguous space. There are strokes that affect several parts of the cortex at the same time. Those, we don't get into that. But what we find for focal lesions in this model is that there seems to be a second order phase transition. Below a certain threshold, or below a certain lesions below a certain size, they seem to prefer a local reorganization in which lost function is pushed around, is pushed in the boundary of the lesion, which now takes care of the function that has been lost. Above this threshold, and very quickly, this block here is the curve of what happens right after the stroke. Very, very quickly, when the lesion is larger than the threshold, the other side of the brain seems to take over. We find some evidence that there is some criticality in this second order phase transition. This is interesting because this means that when the lesion is around critical, it is optimal for intervention. So that, in clinical terms, that will give us a window of intervention if you want to return everything to the original site. After retraining, some of the lesion remain with a transfer of functionality to the other side of the brain. Some of it remains reattached to the peripheral lesion. Importantly, all this model, when it is contrasted with what we find in the literature, I think it streamlines what the clinical findings are actually saying. When you look at the literature very closely, and what we find is
it's precisely this tree here. So you start with the lesion. If the lesion is small enough, then reorganization is peripheral. If the lesion is large enough, then reorganization calls for the other side of the brain to take over the lost function. In some cases, you can retrieve it back. And in the paper about this, we explore optimal interventions to retrieve back what has been sent to the other side of the brain. In other cases, it remains there. All of this fits the best data that we have in the literature, but importantly, this model was not fitted to data. It was developed from first principles, which I think is quite powerful. And this is the end of my talk. Final summary, I wanted to call your attention again about this interplay between the symmetry that your brain has because we are bilaterians and the symmetry that the different tasks demands. There is a contact point in there, an interesting phenomenology happening around there. The other thing is that a lot of the ideas that have been floating around, particularly in the second part of the talk, they have to do with symmetry, of course, with the possibility of these self-organized maps to redistribute themselves, and with topology. If we go back to this, and we compare this with the case in which there is no mirror symmetry, what these maps are telling us is that there is something cognitively connecting. Cognitively, it also means that there has to be a physical substrate, of course, that is connecting both sides of the brain. There is if you think about the brain and the mind and the representations that emerge as a very abstract mathematical object, there are connections that go from one side to the other, making these objects topologically distinct. Topology is a very tough branch of mathematics that I love. Is this one in which a donut and a mug are the same object? I think that topology might have a lot to say about the mathematics of brain representations. If you think about what happens when you have a lesion, there is an equivalent to the topological operation in which you just cut a surface. Literally, in here, you have something that is represented, that is grounded. It has roots in some part of the brain, and because you lose a hemisphere, this is uprooted. And once this is uprooted, following dynamics that remind me a lot to things that we see in mathematical algebraic topology of how surfaces flow one into the other, just as that happens, the brain, the representation falls over itself. So topology is a topic that I really love, and to study it in regard or in the context of brain representations is something that I'm eager to do. If any of you knows about topology, please talk to me. If any of you know someone who knows about topology, please tell me whom I should talk to. This is it now, for real. I just wanted to put the final slides with my two collaborators. The main paper I discussed, I did on my own, and also this review that I think is actually very, very beautiful. Not because I did it, but because I really think it's beautiful. But unfortunately, it's an entropy, which is it has fallen in disgrace as a journal, so nobody reads and cites those things anymore. But I think that I have put some interesting ideas in there. And this work, which is the second part about brain reorganization after hemispherectomy or stroke. Hemispherectomy, I did it with Ricard Soler, my PhD supervisor, and stroke, I did it with Alba Carballo Castro. She's a brilliant PhD student now in Lausanne, in Switzerland. And I will be super happy to take your questions, discuss about it, or any other topic that I mentioned in the talk. Thank you very much.
Does anyone have any questions? And I'll be passing the mic around since there might be online participants.
Thank you for the talk. Could you go back to the first half and explain again how do you go from bilateral to lateral as well as lateral to bilateral when there's more complexity?
Sorry, how you go when you increase the complexity?
Yeah.
All right. So what I have put in here, first of all, is that in here I only have two model parameters: the error rate and the coordination cost. The individual cost of each of the units is very boring. It acts just linearly, so it's just like looking at this map and sifting it downwards. So, but when in the paper I discuss it briefly, and that everything checks out. So the first thing is that for each of these combinations, there is an optimal. If you have there is an optimal configuration, either lateral or bilateral. If you have a simple task inside this parable, it's a parable. Inside this parable here, the preferred configuration is bilateral. Outside of it is lateralized. All right. So there are many ways to go around that, but let's go in this way. Imagine that you have, let's say, 10 different things, 10 different subtasks that have evolved separately since the origin of the brain, such as semantic representation, or whatever you're going to need for syntax, whatever you're going to need for grammar, whatever you're going to need for controlling the vocal cords, and so on and so forth. All right, before language existed, they don't need to be in a final form. You can think of this as a less complexity task that has been performing a function on its own. Okay, and now the evolutionary opportunity presents itself to take these proto subtasks and focus them into a new, more complex task to make them work together. All right. So for each one of them individually, let's say they are an atomic thing. Let's say they don't have their own inner complexity, but that's another thing that we can get into if you want. So for each one of them individually, they are solving just one task, and their map look like this. So inside of here, I should retain the two sides of the brain. Outside of here, in the big area, you should lateralize. All right. So now let's imagine that you are in a task such that bilaterality is preferred. Points inside this area. All right. And now this evolutionary opportunity presents itself for them to collaborate and to do something more complex together. But the benefits of this something more complex, which is going to be language in my example, you only gain them if all of them work properly in unison. If one of them is lost in between, you get some serious pathology, as in the case of the original subjects by Broca. All right. So when the 10 of these subtasks need to work together, the new evolutionary pressures towards the evolution of this more complex cognitive task impose this new map, the outside one. They impose that the new area in which you prefer bilateral is this darker one, and the new area in which you prefer lateralized is the lighter, including the blue. So for any area, for any combination of points of initial tasks that originally dwelt here, the emergence of these new, more complex cognitive tasks imposes that there is a transition from preferring a bilateral circuitry to preferring a lateralized one. And the more complexity, meaning the more subtasks that you have to bring together in this model, complexity is a thorny word, the more complexity that you have, the stronger the evolutionary pressures are to lose the initial bilaterality.
Hi. So you're basically breaking a mirror symmetry in some way, right? Left versus right. You break.
Yes.
Yeah. You're breaking a mirror symmetry. So
Yes.
it sounds an awful lot like an easing order parameter. Is there any sense in which you're allowed to consider one upon coordination cost as being like a temperature?
Sorry, I'm a little bit deaf. If I can get closer, or you can.
I speak pretty quietly.
Yeah, it is.
So you're breaking a mirror symmetry.
Yes.
We'll leave chirality out of it. That's a lot like an easing order parameter in a statistical physics problem. Is there any sense in which you can consider one upon coordination cost to be like a temperature?
I see.
Because at the moment you have your high symmetry state packaged up inside the low symmetry state, and that's not normally the way that phase transitions work.
Yeah.
Right, you usually start off at high temperature with a very high symmetry, and you come down and break it, and you have an order parameter that tells you about breaking it.
Yeah.
So I don't know if this makes any kind of physiological sense, but if I just take one upon your coordination cost axis, you flip those regions, and you end up with something like a critical point at the top of.
Yeah, I will be super.
Does that make any sense?
I think it's a very interesting take on it. I don't have a direct intuition. I think if the coordination cost is very high, I could fathom that you can model this as something antiferromagnetic.
Yeah, I mean that. I'm saying that becomes like zero temperature, and high temperature is effectively at the bottom of your diagram, and then you flip the region so that the high symmetry thing is at high temperature, which is what you expect, and then you as you bring something controlling entropy down, you break the symmetry. I guess I'm just wondering if there is any kind of balance of entropy symmetry.
I think it's a very interesting
interpretation of this, because the shape it's exactly the shape that you'd expect if it was a symmetry breaking phase transition. It's just kind of the phases are kind of the wrong way around.
Yeah, this is a phase space. So, and I really think that the phenomenology is akin to phase transitions. And I'm careful not to say phase transitions because I know some people get angry. But I think that this is the kind of things that we are observing. And I will not be surprised if this could be mapped into an ISIM model. I would love to. It seems like a very interesting take. And if you think about that, when you have this comes from a utility function, and you can think of it as an energy. Currently, there isn't an entropy in here, there isn't any way in which I have put entropies in here. It will be interesting to think about that. So,
yeah, I can't imagine that you can work on a complex problem and not have entropy in there. Honestly.
Oh, definitely, yeah, it's
somewhere. How?
It is probably hidden somewhere. I mean, it definitely has to do with the error rate, right? Like that is a chance that you're going to misperform or you're not directed to the right solution. So it has to be there somewhere. Yeah, I didn't put it explicitly. Thanks for the question.
Thanks very much. For the second part of your talk, the ability to reconfigure following a lesion depended on mirror symmetry across the sides. And you have this example of the removing half the brain, and people can do most of their things normally, suggesting that there was some sort of bilateral symmetry. In the first, this part, you're saying that as you increase the complexity, there's a push towards more laterality and a breaking of the symmetry. So how do you put these two parts of your talk together?
Like this. Like it's a complex landscape. Different tasks are going to have different pressures for them. If you think the first part talks a lot to whatever happens down here, in which you have a mirror symmetry that is provided, and then you have a set of tasks that don't really need that mirror symmetry. They don't have a explicit pressure to sustain them. Those can be included. You can explicitly make you can modify the utility functions to introduce a parameter that is going to benefit, is going to say, well, my task is mirror symmetric. So it really pays off to keep both sides. That can be included. But what I really think is that the reality is the brain is big and you have a lot of things in it. So what I think is that this interplay, and that's why I wanted to call the attention to this interplay between these two sets of symmetries that come and go. This interplay creates a complex landscape. There is more evidence, not only from the remove half a brain, but also from people who have stroke. When I say that the functionality is moved to the functionality is moved to the other side of the brain, this literally means that I have a stroke on the left side and I lose mobility to my right side. I can recover.
Oh, you can continue. I was just.
So if you have a stroke in your right hemisphere affecting the motor control of the right hand, you lose mobility in the right hand, and this can be recovered over time. And sometimes it happens because the area surrounding the lesion took over what has been lost, and sometimes it happens because the other side of the brain took over. And I think of this like, well, you have a circuit that is at the other side that is ready to do the task that it needs to be done. So there is a very parsimonious reason to do that. People are trying to immobilize, to have therapies in which you immobilize a healthy hand so that you move the other one. Our simulation suggests that this is not good, because when you immobilize the healthy hand, what you are doing is you're releasing that circuit so that the lost function is relocated to the wrong side of the brain. So this, at least in the motor cortex, this redundancy persists. But for things like language, we know that it doesn't. So this is how I reconcile the two things. It's a complex landscape.
All right, so I think we're about out of time. So thank you so much for attending this presentation by Dr. Luis. So he'll be here until, I believe, the end of November if you have any additional questions, and feel free to stop by the visiting program office. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.